Thank you. Good afternoon. So let's see, are we up? Yes. I always love to start with Agile Yoda. So this is a talk that is a little bit of a tasting menu. I normally do a full-day workshop on lean accessibility, and I'll be doing that tomorrow as well. So shameless plug, all proceeds go to charity. And so this is going to hopefully leave you hungry and wanting more, and just know that I'm not really sure how long this talk will go. So if I have to speed through something and you want to talk to me, I am super available, would love to be able to connect with you. So this is a picture of my niece. Her name is also Elle. And she lives in San Antonio, Texas, with my little sister. And I was visiting my sister, and we were going from San Antonio to Austin, where I was speaking at a conference. So we had about an hour in the car together. This was a few years ago. And I am a confessed, acknowledged, hello, my name is Elle. I'm an Amazon one-click addict. And she had never heard of what Amazon Prime was about. So how many of you guys are either familiar with Amazon Prime or recognize that you want some way to disable the one-click ease of constantly getting things shipped to you? I wanted her to be addicted to it like me. And so we were in the car on the way to this conference, and I said, I know, I will add you to my Amazon Prime membership as a family member. That way you don't have to pay for the annual membership, and you too can figure out the joys of what it would mean to give this little girl books and everything at the one-click kind of ease. So I had an Android phone at this point, and I went up to, Amazon.com on the mobile browser, and it says, hello, Elizabeth Waters, member since November 15th, 2010, membership Prime. So I'm looking through this, and I realize it's optimized for mobile, but I couldn't find the link on how to be able to add somebody to my Prime membership. So I did the next thing that most people who work in tech would do. I went straight to Google, and I decided, okay, how do I add a family member to my Prime membership? The very first link, as you can see, is an Amazon link, so I was feeling pretty confident that help share your Amazon Prime benefits. I select that link, and I get this really long, obviously not optimized for mobile, but that's okay. I get this long wall of text, and I see about halfway down, go to manage my Prime membership, right there. So I say, okay. So I click that, and I get to, hello, Elizabeth Waters, member since November 15th, 2010. I'm like, okay, I will not be thwarted by this. We're in the car. I had nothing else to do. So I scroll down, and I see this other place that we all are afraid to tread into, Amazon.com full site. I'm like, it's okay. As I mentioned before, I'm a bit of an addict. I know this site way too well. So I'm prepared for what comes next. Yes, the big, giant, cluttered experience with all these product images and constant, walls of tiny text. But it's okay, because I know where to go on the desktop site. So it's almost like I'm doing it, in my sleep. So I see this menu up at the top right. Those of you guys who travel around on Amazon know it's the same years later. And I click on that, and I get this drop down, and I'm like, okay, so somewhere in the middle of there it is, your Prime membership. So I select that link. Hello, Elizabeth Waters, member since November 15th, 2010. So I just wanted to add my sister to my Amazon Prime membership. And this took me, I guess, about 10 minutes maybe of frustration trying to find this. And somebody could understandably say to me, this is not an accessibility issue. You could argue that it's maybe not even just a usability issue, it's a missed requirement. It's somewhere in the middle of these user task flows. Somebody forgot to account for what would happen on a mobile device if somebody wanted to do this. However, disability is often a usability amplifier. And by that, what I mean is, when we do work with people with disabilities, we find the same issues that somebody who does usability testing with people without disabilities, only it's 10 times harder. So if it took me about 8 to 10 minutes or so of struggling around and frustration and a great deal of tenacity to try and get through that, it might have taken somebody an hour to try and be able to get through that experience on a mobile phone if somebody had disabilities. And of course, they probably won't stick around for an hour. But likewise, the inverse is true as well. So if you conduct usability testing and you find something is really easy to use, things are discoverable, and somebody understands where they are in a task flow and whether or not they know what's about to happen next, it is that much more appreciated by people with disabilities, because so often they get these kinds of experiences which lock them out of that entire customer experience. So again, today, right now, Lean Accessibility, the talk, which is a bit of a preview for Lean Accessibility, the workshop, again, shameless plug, and the goal is to think about how to build accessibility into your product lifecycle in a very agile way. My name is Elle Waters. I work at an accessibility agency that focuses on inclusive design and accessibility. That's all we do. It's called Level Access. You can reach me. I would love to connect with you. I don't know if you guys use that Find Nearby People feature on LinkedIn's mobile app, but it's really helpful, by the way. I highly encourage it at conferences. You can reach me at email or via LinkedIn, or just find me on this landing page. So we do a lot of talk here at this conference, which is really impressive, about how we work as teams. So I thought about this because this has been a conversation that's been ongoing with me and a few of my colleagues. And I don't know if any of you guys have ever seen this model, but it's about how human organizations function. There's a question that's out there: how teal is your organization? So I don't know how many of you may recognize that phrase, but we can talk through it. It's a wonderful book, and it basically talks about the 3 functions, and it's reinventing organizations, the teal paradigm. So we're going to go through that just briefly. It's a little bit crunchy after lunch, but I think it'll set the foundation for how to be thinking about this and the goal of what we're trying to accomplish. If, on the other hand, this is more like what your organization is like, you're not paid to think, a mindless worker is a happy worker, shut up and do your job, then we'll probably have a support group later today for that kind of thing. So the how teal is your organization is about the shift of power. And they've seen these leaps in human evolution in the way that people work together. And the first one is what they would consider the red, where you have basically a very top-down structure. Mafias are this way, and old-fashioned sort of fiefdoms and kingdoms are this way. So we consider that an autocracy, and it's basically all for the king is the phrase. Then you move into a little bit more power among more than just one individual, and you think in terms of army, and this is the amber stage. And so where it's really about all for those in power, the top-down kind of organization. And then here at this orange level, this is actually right around the time of the Industrial Revolution. And this is when what we consider to be business, the way that traditional business organizations are run. The reason why it's called machine is because people are viewed as resources. And that's kind of a not favorite word, because the idea of a resource is you're a cog in the machine, and that when you outlive your usefulness, you're tossed aside and put something else in. And that the goal is really about the profits or whatever that organization needs to thrive. Then we're right around here where we look at co-op or family. This is where a lot of more modern business organizations are, where you think in terms of all for those stakeholders. And it's more like the way that you want to think collaboratively as an organization. You still have some power that is sort of largely moving from top down, but you have a lot more participation from different people in the organization. And then finally, we have the teal organization. So how many of you guys have heard of a holacracy before? I like to see that quite a few of you, actually. And this is about that idea of self-organizing people and knowing that self-organizing teams have this distributed level of thought process so that you're not relying on just a few single people in order to be able to make decisions. So if you take this framework and you look at sort of the way that Agile has moved throughout this organizational shift as well, you can say that waterfall, very top-down, very much control is focused at individual points within the life cycle. Then you move to Scrum, and I don't have anything against Scrum, but it has a lot of guardrails. And it has a lot of structure, and it has a lot of checklists and a lot of ceremonies. Because, again, like Marty was talking about earlier, that there's a period of trust that you need to be able to give that power over to your teams. Then you move into sort of the transitional phase of the idea of Scrumban, where you have a mixture, and the idea is that you have a little bit of structure, you're time boxing your work, and yet at the same time, you're starting to get more interaction from team members because they're able to move more towards this idea of Kanban, which tends to be people self-select the work that they want. And then finally, moving towards lean. And this is not necessarily an evolution. Different teams may need to function different ways. But lean has a very specific goal of knowing that there's a fluid, high focus on self-organizing and determination with teams. And so finally, this shift of power exists in accessibility as well. And this is after a dozen years of working specifically within the accessibility industry. We see organizations that come to us because they're being sued, because they have a lawsuit that's pending and they have no choice but to address it. We see organizations who come to us because, like the EU Web Accessibility Directive, there's a law that's recently come into place, and they're trying to avoid being sued. Then we see organizations that are looking at it as, well, what we know is we have to do this for whatever reason, and we're going to be proactive about it, but we're really looking to outsource all of this. And so you have an agency model where people come in and they do accessibility, and they fix them. Then they recognize at some point, usually, that there's a need to be able to create internal staff. And so you'll have like the 1-800 accessibility geek in the basement who will answer all of the questions that people have. Usually it's one or two people who are sort of in charge of the entire organization for accessibility. And then finally, the teams that are most successful, we find, are those who integrate it into the DNA and what they're doing. So this is all put together by an enterprise agile coach named Charles Calistro. And he said, as humans, our greatest successes have come through collaboration, listening, and adapting, values not built into modern business. Agile is an attempt to bring the natural keys to success into the workplace. So our definitions today, I wanted to sort of level set about those so that you understood where I was coming from. When I talk about lean accessibility, I'm talking about the idea of shifting all of that as teal and as further right as you can for the best success. Based on working with a lot of different kinds of organizations, that's how we see this being most effective. So, let's talk about a few working definitions, and I'll talk a little bit more about accessibility. Some of you guys may be pretty new to understanding what we're talking about, so this provides some context, and hopefully it provides some conversation as well. So, a definition of accessibility, good old Wikipedia: the design of products, services, or environments for people with disabilities. Accessibility can be viewed as the ability to access and benefit from some system or entity. On the other hand, inclusive design, which we talk about a lot, is a little bit different than that. So this is the design of mainstream products and or services that are accessible to, usable by as many people as reasonably possible without the need for special adaptation or specialized design. Our Chief Experience Officer, Derek Featherstone, says, accessibility is an outcome and inclusive design is a process. So we kind of talk about these things, again, interchangeably, but one is the outcome, one is the results of the work that you've done. Inclusive design is how to be able to move through that and the things that you develop as products in an inclusive way. So who does this really impact? A lot of times when I talk with people, they're thinking, you know, this is really like some small group of people, and while it sounds like a really good idea, it's not my main goal, and it's not going to measurably change my business. So how many people have disabilities? The World Health Organization estimates that 1 in 7 people in the world have a disability. So if we do the math on that, it's roughly 15% of the world's population. I don't know if you guys have checked the stats lately, but Internet Explorer / Edge market share of usage, according to the W3C, is about 3.2%. So the next time when you're thinking about building and making sure that you test with Internet Explorer, consider the fact that there's more people with disabilities likely to be using your product than are likely to be using Internet Explorer. I usually tell that to developers because it kind of rocks their world a little bit. So here's for the marketing parts, those who are in product management but think like a marketer. $8 trillion of annual discretionary spending in the world among people with disabilities and their families. It's kind of a big market. Not only that, but these are the most die-hard, loyal customers. Because once they find a company that is committed to the idea of building something inclusively, they will go with you, and they have shown statistically that they will preference a company's product, even if it's more expensive, over something that doesn't have reliable accessibility. So what kinds of disabilities do people have? There's a lot of different kinds. Usually what we're talking about are things that are related to speech, mobility, hearing, visual, neurological, and then the big sort of messy category, other. Oftentimes, this is what we usually find when we're starting to talk to people and provide some education and awareness, that they think about blindness first. That's almost always the first thing people think about. Then deafness or some measure of hearing loss, motor, visual issues, and then they start to think about cognitive. The truth is, though, it is something closer to this. And so, in addition to that, to make it more messy as the human experience, people may have more than one disability. That's often the case. When we do usability studies, we find people have a couple of different disabilities. And two people with the same disability, as it would be categorized, may have completely different abilities, and it may manifest in different ways, and they may solve for that in different ways. So here's some of the tools that people use, just so that you guys are aware. There's hardware, in case you were wondering how detectable this might be using some handy JavaScript on your website. There's a lot of things that people interface with a computer in order to be able to use that website. There's also software that people use. So over here on the left, I have VoiceOver and Zoom settings on iOS. So if you have an iPhone, you have tons of accessibility options that you can really experiment with. Word to the wise, if you decide to turn the screen reader on, make sure you know how to turn it off before you start messing with it. Then there's also really cool color settings within Android devices for people who might have some measure of color deficiency in order to be able to get the kind of color scheme that works best for them. This is a little bit variable as far as the experience because a lot of people sort of hard code some of those color schemes in. There's also a screen reader that reads aloud for people who are visually impaired or people who have cognitive difficulties who want that extra confirmation of the voice interaction in, it's called TalkBack in Android. And then for the desktop, there's NVDA, which is a free open source screen reader. Apple has all of its screen readers built into its products, so whether it be an iPad, iPhone, or a Mac, you'll find VoiceOver, the screen reader. And then for those people who use voice recognition software, it's typically a productivity tool, but made by a company called Nuance, Dragon Naturally Speaking, but they recognize that a ton of people with mobility impairments started using this as an assistive technology. And then finally, for the myriad of people with different kinds of low vision needs, for magnification, there's something called ZoomText that's software. There's also, in a Mac environment, you can see that there's a switch UI. So this mimics the idea of having a single switch like a foot pedal. And basically, it scans through these menus, and you click, and you click, and you click, and it allows you to navigate through that if you have really limited mobility. But what about if you don't actually use any software or any hardware? This is a wonderful cartoon written by a friend of ours, and it speaks to what we call neurodiversity. So that's any kind of brain-related disabilities or individual needs or what people would identify as neurodivergent. And that definitely includes autism. Different people will classify it differently. They'll say, I'm on the spectrum. They'll say, I'm autistic. I have autism spectrum disorder. There's a lot of different ways that people self-identify. And so when somebody says, I'm on the spectrum, a lot of people who don't have this particular condition or setting in their brains are thinking not versus very in a very linear kind of fashion. When the truth is, when you're on the spectrum, it's something a lot more like this, more like a color wheel. So you might have executive function at a very high level. You do great. You might have social anxiety at a very low level. You might have mobility impairments in the middle of all of that as well. And so when you think about disability, think about it more as where do people fit in all these different user needs somewhere in the spectrum. Some other factors that really influence accessibility: aging and accessibility. There's a thing called the silver tsunami, and it's about the increase in the world's population, especially in developed nations where you have access to really great health care. That's going to increase people's lifespan, and as people age, they often age into disabilities. Dementia is of a particular concern because of the fact that one person with every 3 seconds is diagnosed in this world with dementia. That's a pretty high statistic. Some symptoms include forgetfulness, getting lost in familiar places, and behavioral changes. So you can imagine if somebody is using your product, whether it be your mobile application or your website, and they're aging into some cognitive difficulties, how anxious they can become, because it may seem super obvious to you as to what that particular path, that task flow is to purchase that product or sign up for a membership, and yet this can become really, really difficult for people. Another factor is literacy and accessibility. In the world, there are 774 million people in the world who cannot read. That is a concern. Literacy issues are declining, which is good. Educational challenges still exist, though. In the United States alone, over 20% of United States adults, American adults, have a reading grade level of 5th grade or below. And so that's something to consider when you're looking at that, or somebody is a non-native speaker of the language that you build your site in. Then there's mobile usage and accessibility. This is a photograph of 2014 in Budapest. Yeah, you guys know it? I love that you laughed over that. This is an incredible photo, right? Like, besides the fact that Hungarians are super cool because, like, they revolted and said no internet tax. But more than that, look at just the prevalence. Luke Wroblewski talks about the mobile moment. And having a mobile strategy these days is a little bit like having a fax machine strategy, because you really just have a strategy, right, at this point, and mobile is a part of that strategy. We in the accessibility industry love the mobile revolution that has happened because it's basically like opting in to be a low vision user because you need higher contrast, and you have a limited viewport, and people have to build with standards. And so, of course, we're cheering. Yes, responsive web is fantastic. One thing that's important to note, in case you don't already know this, mobile's important, but in the United States alone on Cyber Monday in 2017, nearly 48% of retail site visits came from a mobile device. That's a pretty significant number. And then in addition to that, PayPal's Braintree says that mobile transactions are expected to increase by 74% over the next 3 years. So mobile is a big factor in this conversation that we're having about accessibility. Not only that, but screen reader users, people who might be visually impaired using a screen reader, have been shown that they have 54% of the time they use a mobile device as much or more than a desktop. There's a huge adoption of mobile devices among people with disabilities. Part of the reason for that is because people have the power over their own needs and their own custom settings, and that gives them the ability to set what they want and how they want to consume content. So, most everybody here understands when I say agile. However, I want to talk in broad terms because where we're going next is about how lean accessibility, how an agile approach to accessibility will help you succeed, not just with accessibility, not just with agile, but with everything. So this is the vision that used to be waterfall, this idea that you had this idyllic scenario where everybody would fulfill their part in the phases and the steps. So, business analysts would accurately record every possible requirement that your product needed. And the design phase would never go too long. And people would be able to anticipate exactly what developers needed. And they would build these perfect designs based on user research. And people's needs did not change over the course of several months. And then developers would get this, and they felt that they had a full list of all the requirements, and there were no surprises. So at the very end of this gorgeous, beautifully planned and executed project, you'd have this rainbow, which we would call the product. The reality is something a little more like this. Those of us who are racing through this cascade of information and trying desperately to grab hold of something, if you find yourself in anything that's akin to a waterfall product life cycle, you're basically hoping you're not the guy at the bottom that gets the crash hitting him. And it's really much more like this. I think of this is what a project is really like, right? That it is really much more like being on a ship in the middle of a storm. So for today, a working definition of agile: the ability to create, respond to change, and to succeed in an uncertain and turbulent environment. My favorite example of real agile work where it functions really well actually has nothing to do with the digital world. My favorite example is a professional kitchen. If you ever see and you're ever able and have the privilege to sit at like a chef's table, I'm not talking about Hell's Kitchen. That is not a functional kitchen. But some place where you're able to go in and watch. They're highly communicative, they all understand their roles, but they're able to work collaboratively, and they move and function with the idea of perfect quality and execution and high velocity. This is what Agile should look like. So how do we measure success? Because it's important, especially as product managers, that you want to not just have theory, not just have ideas, although I would argue, always remember that you are paid mostly for the ideas that you have. Whether through your discovery, your shepherding of a product, the business goals, the user experience, value for the customer, ultimately, you need to remember that you are a thought worker. But you have to have results. You have to show something for that. So within accessibility, we have a couple of tried and true ways that we measure accessibility. The first one is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. That's an international group of people from the W3C who got together and started to put down on paper exactly what people needed in order to have an accessible experience. It recently went through an update, so that's why you see 2.0, which is really well adopted across different countries, and 2.1, which just came out in June. This is, and please do remember, this is the technical standard for accessibility. So you can see sort of the nerdy parts, how it's organized, 4 principles, 38 success criteria in 2.0, and really, by and large, level A and level AA, these 38 success criteria, most of the world has harmonized to that standard. So recognizing that if you live in Germany, that there's a national law. If you live in the United States, there's Section 508, which is a procurement law. There's a lot of different things that point back to that. WCAG 2.1, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.1, has 17 more success criteria added to it, focuses mostly on things that have changed. This 2.0 was put out in 2008. So you can imagine when it talks about keyboard, 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 and people are looking at their mobile device thinking, how do I translate that into mobile accessibility requirements? So it starts to address mobile accessibility. Additionally, people with low vision were really underrepresented. By and large, the disability advocacy groups that represent blind individuals are much more galvanized. They are much more singular, and they have very strong representation. People with low vision have lots of different kinds of conditions that may fit within that category. And there's 8 times as many people with low vision as there are people who are blind. And so this attempts to try and address some of that. And then likewise, people with cognitive and learning disabilities, they don't all have one group and say, we are these people, and therefore we will represent our needs. And so this was a goal to try and incorporate that. It's got some more ways to go, but this is a market improvement. So a lot of nations are starting to adopt WCAG 2.1 because it's more modern, it's a little more addressing some of the needs of today. The Web Accessibility Directive in Europe, which recently just passed in September, and basically all 28 nation states have to come up with their own national laws, points to WCAG 2.1. So that was nerdy. But the second piece of accessibility and how it's actually measured is usability and performance standards. It doesn't matter if you have fulfilled all the compliance technical standards if, when in actuality, you haven't even really made it easy for people to use. So there's a lot of laws that really speak to that, including the EU Web Accessibility Directive. In short, we measure accessibility by this. We make things work for everyone, regardless of their abilities. So how do we measure Agile and success for Agile? I think that this is something that we can look at, that these are key concepts within Agile. There are also ways that we can measure success. Prioritize value in the work and the delivery. Increase velocity, get and use feedback, adapt, and improve. So value is a huge function of what we talk about as far as success with Agile. So according to Christian Vervis, founder of Agilistic, he defines different definitions of value. So when you're a product manager and you're speaking to different people and you say this has value, you need to consider what kind of value you're talking about. And likewise, lean accessibility also has value. So the commercial value, it increases usability, speeds up task flow completion. The market value, it increases potential new customers by up to 15%. Efficiency value, accessibility requires that you standardize some of your processes. So through that, it increases your operational efficiency and decreases those costs. So if you don't yet have a design system, even a terrible design system is better than no design system. Start today if you don't. And then it increases customer loyalty and future-proofs your work to provide more value later on. So you guys may have seen some version of this before. Why is this not an Agile way to work? It's a participation. Anybody? So we have a lot of frowny faces. That's right, you can't drive it till the end. It doesn't even have a steering wheel here. So it's not functional until the very end. So the idea of Agile, of course, is to be able to say, well, what we want to be able to do is provide value early and often. So while somebody says, I want a rainbow shaded SUV, you say, look, here's what I can give you the first time we deal this. We'll give you a skateboard, because at least it gets you from point A to point B. And then you increase and iterate on those things until you improve. So each time that you're building something better until you have that final product. So accessibility and Agile go hand to hand. That's why I have peanut butter and jelly for them. Lean accessibility makes you better and faster. So let's talk about how, and I'm going to scoot past this in the interest of time. I'm going to, like I said, I wasn't sure how far I'd be able to get. And I'm going to, because I want to leave some questions open. So here. How do I test for accessibility in a lean and agile way? In the workshop, we'll go through how to build user stories, how to build out requirements and be able to make that manageable, and how to design from a UX perspective in order to be able to make that a lean process. But again, what ends up becoming one of the fundamental areas of focus for accessibility is testing. So here's your designer's minimum viable product when it comes to testing, which I will come back over here. The number one thing we see from design that are issues that people face have to do with color contrast. So I love the Impact website. However, I will say that there are some things that probably could be improved, and this is a very common thing that people struggle with. We have ways that can not harsh your design buzz and still be able to make things sufficient color contrast. This is the number one thing. The next thing would be images, the second most common thing. So people often put images out there and they don't have a text equivalent for them, and that becomes a real issue for people with visual impairments. The third most common thing is structure. So if you guys have ever looked at the headings on your website without the CSS enabled and to see, could you really understand what that website is if you didn't have anything else but the headings to read the content by? That's an example. And then the fourth thing, and we'll have a fun exercise on this on Wednesday, but it's about proximity. So if you have related activities in a form here, but your submit button is way off to the side, people who are zoomed way in on that screen may never know what the action needs to be to have that work. If you design for mobile first, you likely have already addressed issues with proximity because it's very similar. And then finally, everything else. So as a designer, focus first on contrast, deliver that, then focus on images, then focus on structure, then focus on proximity, then talk to me, and we'll go further than that. So what's a lean accessibility testing model for a developer? The first, number one thing is keyboard accessibility. Every person who has mobility impairments, every sighted keyboard user, every non-sighted individual, they all rely on keyboard-like interfaces. And this works from a responsive point of view as well, that if you build to make sure that everything is actionable, can be tabbed to, that you can escape out of modal dialogues, you find so many issues get resolved. The next, not surprisingly, would be images. So after your content strategists have come up with this wonderful alternate text, make sure that you actually implement that. The third, which is a little bit sneaky, is the idea of forms. Because we know that forms are basically that which powers almost every digital interaction. And they are also the most complex interactions for people with disabilities to navigate through. Well-designed forms are a delight, And you guys know this, because when you're filling out something and it becomes difficult, go back to earlier when I was talking about it being an amplifier for people with disabilities. If you have a form interaction that you go through and you think, this is so frustrating, it automatically threw me into an error state, and I haven't even finished typing my email address. This is the kind of thing. If you design it according to standards, you'll find out that you've hit 60% of your accessibility issues. And then next, after you've built that up iteratively, you focus on dynamic content. There's a lot of things that developers point to as the most complex things for accessibility, and this, I will grant you, is definitely something that takes some instruction and guiding them through that. But when we did a survey over 4 years of testing research, we found that 60 to 70% of the issues that we logged as accessibility issues pointed straight back to web standards. So, you know, I hate to tell a developer to do their jobs. However, I would say if they are adamant about web standards, they end up becoming accessibility champions pretty easily. And then the dynamic content is just really exciting and challenging work. And then finally, of course, everything else. So the benefits of inclusive design and the idea of lean accessibility. If you design for blind or deaf customers, it helps you with discoverability and SEO. If you design for people with low vision or mobility challenges, it actually helps your mobile users as well. And if you design for someone with cognitive difficulties, it actually makes your whole user experience more usable, and therefore it helps everyone. I'm going to pass through the lean accessibility testing and point to this. This is really something to consider from a research, content, design, development, and testing perspective. So involve people outside your organization, focus on behavior and thinking. Under content, focus on something called plain language, which really is a wonderful structure on how to develop your content, semantic structure, and front load your content so that people don't have to wait to get through to understand what the point is. From a design perspective, again, focus on color contrast, visual and spatial relationships, and linear flow. From a development perspective, semantics and programmatic relationships, linear flow and keyboard. And from a testing perspective, think in terms of not just functional testing, but also usability. We conduct a lot of usability studies with people with disabilities, and it's really, once you learn the tools of how to do that, you can incorporate that into your daily work. So as product managers, you're probably the keeper of that vision, that product strategy, and yet this shouldn't be yours alone to carry. You might shepherd it, you might be able to encourage people, you might exhort people to do their best work, but at the same time, this really is something that belongs to everyone. I'll leave you with this. Imani Barbarin had a quote on Twitter that I thought was especially impactful. Accessibility is not just a set of physical things that are put into place, but a living language that speaks to who society decides to value based on who they allow into the public sphere. Should access not be created, you have spoken to that value system. Questions?
First applause.
Thanks.
Am I on? I'll read out the questions, and you're more than welcome to say, come to the workshop on Wednesday because you're doing it for charity.
Yes. First question, what would you tell users who expect your product to be fully accessible? Well, my first question would be, is it? If you don't know, that's probably, most people don't accidentally find themselves with an accessible product. But you can, if you can't make the workshop, you can email me and I will give you some things that we call smoke tests, which are like 5-minute tests to see how much work is ahead of you in order to be able to do that. What most people who ask that kind of question is not a finished, accessible end state. They would love that, but they don't expect that. What they want to know is that you have a plan. They want to know you have a commitment to them and a plan. and that you communicate and involve them, and that it's not something where they can't also participate in that experience. We hear about examples of companies underestimating importance of accessibility. What is your favorite example of a company that is doing accessibility right? So, full disclosure, my company works with a lot of really well-known brands. So I can only speak to those companies that I've worked with. There's some cautionary tales of companies that are not doing accessibility well that I'm very aware of that we won't talk about. But just so you're aware, like I said, this is a company that we went through an entire journey with them. My favorite example is probably Scribd.com. That's SCRIBD.com. They consider themselves the Netflix of online books, and they were incredibly devoted to the idea of a design-centered experience and incredibly worried about what accessibility would do to them. And they went through a lawsuit, and they selected us as their partner in order to be able to make them more accessible. And they're now champions of accessibility because they see that it accelerated their product development life cycle, and they look at it as a way to build in good habits, and they've seen their market share increase. So that would probably be my favorite example recently. What is the overlap between people having disabilities and using IE? So, while there are studies that show that people with disabilities upgrade their software less frequently than somebody without disabilities, because if it's working, they don't want to throw that into chaos by upgrading. There is some evidence to show that. Generally speaking, if you take that 15% group, say 15% of your customers are people with disabilities, and then you look at your own browser statistics. Do you have a lot of people who are using Internet Explorer? If not, then there's a likelihood that you don't have a lot of people with disabilities using Internet Explorer on your site. So I always point companies back to their own web analytics as an understanding of the profile of people that are using their site or their application.
Okay, Elle, we have to stop there. Sorry, the little counter went to 0.
Oh, sorry.
I'm sorry, it's okay. I just follow what the machines tell me. Okay, we're going to take a quick 2-minute break, and then we'll be back with Daniel Wilson. It's raining outside, so don't even bother leaving. Just make that kind of general hum that you make while you're waiting for the next person to speak. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Also, I have business cards right here in case anybody wants to grab one and chat with me later.